Japan is one of the only countries on Earth that was never successfully invaded for almost 2,000 years. Not by the Mongols, who conquered basically the entire known world. Not by anyone. But here's the strange part. In 1974, a Japanese soldier named Hiro Onoda was found hiding in the jungle on a tiny island in the Philippines, still fighting World War II. The war had ended 29 years earlier. Nobody had told him, and even when they did, he refused to believe it. They had to fly in his old commanding officer, now a retired bookseller, to personally order him to stop. That's the kind of country Japan is. And this is only the beginning. Over 2,000 years, Japan copied China and beat it at its own game, locked its own doors for 250 years, got dragged into the modern world at gunpoint, built an empire, lost everything to 2 atomic bombs, and then rose from the ashes to become the second richest nation on the planet in a single lifetime. Japan's real superpower was never the sword or the bomb. It was something it did twice that no other nation dared to do. Let's start at the very beginning. 300 AD gods, emperors, and a land of warring tribes about 2,000 years ago, the islands we now call Japan were not a country. They were a scattered patchwork of tribes, rice farmers, and warlords, all squabbling over the best valleys and the best rivers. These people had arrived over thousands of years, crossing from the Asian mainland, and they slowly settled into villages built around one thing above all else: rice. Rice was everything. Rice was food, rice was wealth, rice was power. If you controlled the rice, you controlled the people. Over time, one group in the center of the country, near modern-day Nara, started winning. They were called the Yamato. And the Yamato had a genius idea for how to make everyone obey them. They claimed their chief wasn't just a chief. He was descended directly from the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. Look at this map. See this fertile heartland around the Yamato plain? That's the seed that everything else grows from. The leader took a new title, emperor, and declared he was living family of the gods. And here's the wild part. That same family line still sits on the throne of Japan today. It is the oldest continuous royal family in the entire world, stretching back over 1,500 years. But being a god emperor didn't mean you actually ran anything. That problem would haunt Japan for the next 1,000 years. First, though, Japan needed to grow up. And to do that, it looked across the sea at the most advanced civilization on Earth. 600 Japan copies China and makes it better. Just across the water sat China, a colossal empire with cities, writing, laws, and philosophy, while Japan was still mostly wooden villages. So Japan did something smart. Instead of resenting the giant next door, it decided to steal everything that giant had. A prince named Shotoku sent students, monks, and officials pouring across the sea to study China and bring the best bits home. Japan borrowed China's writing system. It borrowed China's style of government. It borrowed China's calendar, art, and city planning. And in 552, it borrowed something that would change the soul of the country forever: Buddhism. But here's the thing about Japan. It never just copies. It absorbs, then twists it into something uniquely its own. Emperor, the monks from China are here. They brought a new religion. We already have gods. We have thousands of them. This one is different. It has temples, statues, and something called enlightenment. Do we have to give up our old gods? No, sir. You can just keep all of them and add this one on top. So more gods. I like more gods. Bring it in. And that's basically what happened. Japan didn't replace its native Shinto beliefs with Buddhism. It kept both, stacked on top of each other, and somehow made it work. By the year 700, Japan had a proper capital, a proper bureaucracy, and a proper written language. It looked like a mini China. But copying China had one huge side effect nobody expected. The nobles who ran the government got soft, rich, and lazy, writing poetry while the real muscle of the country was quietly moving somewhere else entirely, into the hands of men with swords. 1185 The rise of the samurai. While the emperor and his fancy court sat in the capital writing poems about the moon, the actual land out in the countryside was getting dangerous. Bandits roamed the roads. Rival families fought over territory. And the soft nobles in the capital had no idea how to fight. So they hired people who did. These hired warriors became known as the samurai, which literally means those who serve. At first they were just muscle for hire. But over the years, two samurai families grew so powerful they basically became the strongest forces in all of Japan, the Taira and the Minamoto. And of course, two powerful families with private armies could only end one way. In a brutal 5-year war, the Minamoto crushed the Taira in an enormous sea battle where the losing side, rather than surrender, walked into the ocean and drowned themselves, including a 7-year-old emperor. The Minamoto leader, a cold and calculating man named Yoritamo, now had all the power in Japan. But he did something clever. He didn't overthrow the emperor. He let the god emperor keep sitting on his throne, looking pretty, while Yoritamo took a new title and ran everything from behind the curtain. That title was Shogun, Supreme Military Dictator. Congratulations, Yoritamo. You control the whole country now. Are you going to become emperor? Absolutely not. Why not? You won. You could take the throne. Too much paperwork. Too many ceremonies. Too many people watching. So what do you want? I want the emperor to stay on his throne, waving at crowds, blessing the harvest. And I'll quietly run the army, the taxes, and the entire country from over here. So he does all the boring parts, and you have all the power. Now you're getting it. For the next 700 years, that's exactly how Japan worked. Emperors up front as living gods. Shoguns in the back holding the actual power. But barely a century into this new samurai world, Japan was about to face the single most terrifying enemy the planet had ever produced. 1274 The Divine Wind. By the late 1200s, the Mongols had conquered the largest land empire in human history, stretching from Korea all the way to Eastern Europe. Their leader, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, looked across the sea at Japan and sent a simple message: surrender or be destroyed. The Japanese response was to execute his messengers, which is a bold move when you're a small island being threatened by the people who had flattened half of Asia. So in 1274, the Mongols came. A massive fleet crossed from Korea carrying tens of thousands of warriors. The samurai fought bravely, but they were used to formal one-on-one duels, and the Mongols fought in disciplined waves with poison arrows and exploding bombs. Japan was in serious trouble. And then the sky saved them. A gigantic typhoon roared in from the ocean and smashed the Mongol fleet to splinters. Thousands of Mongols drowned. The survivors limped home. Great Khan, the invasion failed. What do you mean failed? I sent the largest fleet in the world. There was a storm, sir. A big one. Most of the ships sank. Fine. Build more ships. We go again. Twice as big this time. 7 years later, in 1281, Kublai tried again with an even more enormous fleet, one of the largest naval invasions in history before the modern era. And unbelievably, the exact same thing happened. Another colossal typhoon appeared out of nowhere and annihilated the Mongol fleet a second time. Japan was saved twice by freak storms at the exact moment it needed them most. The Japanese became convinced these winds were sent by the gods to protect their sacred islands. They gave the storms a name, kamikaze, meaning divine wind. Remember that word. It comes back in the most tragic way possible about 700 years later. Japan had survived the Mongols. But the cost of defending the country nearly bankrupted the government, and the samurai families who did the fighting felt cheated of their rewards. The whole system started to crack. And soon Japan would tear itself apart from the inside. 1467, a century of chaos. The shogun's grip slowly weakened until, in 1467, the whole thing collapsed into total anarchy. A dispute over who should be the next shogun exploded into a war that burned the capital, Kyoto, to the ground. And once central authority was gone, every ambitious warlord in the country realized the same thing at the same time. Nobody's actually in charge anymore. Look at this map. See it fracture into dozens of little warring territories, each one ruled by a local warlord called a daimyo? This is the Sengoku period, the age of the country at war, and it lasted for over 100 years. It was a brutal, backstabbing free-for-all where warlords betrayed each other constantly, sons overthrew fathers, and generals murdered the very lords they served. My lord, wonderful news. Your neighbor has agreed to an alliance. Excellent. And you trust him? Completely, sir. We signed a sacred oath in front of a shrine. Post extra guards tonight. But we're allies now. We were allies with the last 3 families too. Where are they now? Dead, sir. Mostly betrayed at dinner parties. Then you understand why we're not going to dinner. For 100 years, Japan was a meat grinder of shifting alliances and constant war. But out of that chaos, 3 extraordinary men would rise, one after another, each one taking Japan a step closer to unification. Together they are the most famous trio in Japanese history, and there's an old saying that perfectly describes how each of them operated. 1600 The 3 unifiers. The saying goes like this. If the bird will not sing, the first man says, I will kill it. The second man says, I will make it want to sing. The third man says, I will wait until it sings. 3 men, 3 completely different personalities, and between them they built modern Japan. The first was Oda Nobunaga, ruthless, brilliant, and terrifying. Nobunaga did something no traditional samurai would do. He embraced new European guns, muskets brought by Portuguese traders, and used them to blast his enemies off the battlefield while they were still politely lining up for sword duels. He conquered nearly half of Japan before one of his own generals betrayed him and surrounded him in a temple. Trapped and doomed, Nobunaga set the temple on fire and killed himself rather than be captured. Enter the second man, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who started life as a dirt-poor peasant, the lowest of the low, and rose through pure cunning to become Nobunaga's top general. Hideyoshi avenged his master, crushed the remaining warlords, and nearly finished uniting the entire country. He was so proud of his rise that he tried to conquer Korea and even dreamed of taking China. That went badly. Then he died, leaving a 5-year-old son as his heir, which in a country full of ambitious warlords is basically ringing a dinner bell. And that brings us to the third and most patient man of all, Tokugawa Ieyasu. So Hideyoshi is dead and his heir is a small child. Correct, my lord? The other warlords have sworn to protect the boy. And do they mean it? Not even slightly. They're already forming factions. Good. Then we let them fight each other. We wait. We make promises to everyone. And we betray at exactly the right moment. That sounds patient. I've been patient my whole life. I can wait a little longer. In the year 1600, all that patience paid off at a single massive battle called Sekigahara, where tens of thousands of samurai clashed in the mud and fog. Thanks to some clever backstabbing arranged in advance, Tokugawa won decisively. 3 years later he became shogun, and his family would rule Japan for the next 250 years. But the way the Tokugawa kept control was one of the strangest decisions any country has ever made. They decided the outside world was too dangerous. So they locked the door. 1639 Japan locks the door. The Tokugawa shoguns looked at the outside world and saw a threat. European traders had brought guns, but they had also brought Christianity, and missionaries were converting hundreds of thousands of Japanese people. to a shogun who wanted total control. A religion that told people to obey a foreign god above their local lord was pure poison. So the shogun made a radical decision. In 1639, Japan sealed itself off from almost the entire world. This policy was called Sakoku, meaning the closed country. Christianity was banned and brutally crushed. Almost no foreigner was allowed in. Almost no Japanese person was allowed to leave. Anyone who tried to sail away and come back could be executed. Look at this map. See Japan go dark, cut off from the entire globe like it pressed pause on the outside world? My lord, a European ship is requesting to trade. Turn it away. They have silk, science, weapons, new ideas. Exactly. That's the problem. New ideas. But the rest of the world is changing fast. What if we fall behind? We won't fall behind. We'll simply pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist. For how long? Oh, a couple of centuries should do it. And astonishingly, it worked for a while. For over 200 years, Japan lived in near total isolation. And this bubble created something beautiful and strange. Inside the sealed islands, a rich and peaceful culture blossomed. This was the golden age of the geisha, of kabuki theater, of haiku poetry, of those iconic woodblock prints of giant waves. Cities grew huge. Edo, modern-day Tokyo, became one of the largest cities on the planet, and almost nobody outside Japan even knew what it looked like. But while Japan slept behind its locked door, the outside world was not standing still. It was building steam engines, factories, and warships made of iron. And one day, that outside world was going to come knocking. Except it didn't knock. It showed up with cannons. 1853. The black ships. On a summer day in 1853, the people of a Japanese fishing village looked out at the bay and saw something that made no sense. Four enormous ships, black with iron and belching thick black smoke into the sky, moving against the wind with no sails. To people who had been sealed off for 250 years, these looked like floating dragons. They called them the Black Ships. On board was an American naval commander named Matthew Perry, and he had a blunt message from the United States. Open your country to trade, or else. He even brought a white flag as a not-so-subtle hint about what would happen if Japan refused. My lord, four monstrous ships have appeared in the bay. They breathe smoke and fire. Tell them we are closed. We've been closed for 250 years. They know, sir. They don't care. The commander demands we open for trade. And if we say no? Then he gestured at his cannons and mentioned, quite casually, that they could level our coastal cities. Ah. Our defenses. What do we have? Swords, my lord. Very beautiful swords. Against the cannons. The swords are extremely sharp. Japan was in shock. Their proud samurai warriors, masters of the sword, were suddenly staring at industrial warships that could flatten their cities before a single blade was drawn. They had no choice. Japan signed the treaties and opened its doors. And this humiliation, being forced open at gunpoint by foreigners, sent a shockwave through the entire country. Ordinary Japanese and young samurai alike were furious. The shogun looked weak. He had failed to protect the sacred islands. And a dangerous new idea started spreading. What if the whole 700-year-old system of shoguns was the problem? What if it was finally time to give power back to the emperor? That idea would explode into a revolution that transformed Japan faster than any nation in history. 1868. The Meiji Miracle. In 1868, after a short, sharp civil war, the samurai rebels who wanted change won. They toppled the shogun, ended 700 years of military dictatorship, and restored the emperor to actual power for the first time in centuries. A teenage emperor named Meiji sat at the center of it all. This event is called the Meiji Restoration, And what happened next is honestly one of the most incredible transformations any country has ever pulled off. The new leaders looked at the world and made a cold, brilliant decision. If we can't beat the Western powers, we will become one. And they did it at breakneck speed. Japan tore down its old feudal system in a matter of years. It built railroads, telegraph lines, factories, and modern schools. It hired foreign experts to teach it everything, then sent its brightest minds abroad to learn and bring the knowledge home. It built a modern army based on the Germans and a modern navy based on the British. And in the middle of all this, the government abolished the samurai class entirely. The very warriors who had ruled Japan for 700 years were told their time was over. So let me understand this. We samurai overthrew the shogun to restore the emperor. That's correct. And now the emperor's new government is abolishing the samurai. Us. Also correct. We can't carry our swords anymore. No more swords in public, no. We don't get our salaries. Replaced with a small one-time payment. And our special status, passed down for centuries? Gone. You're all just regular citizens now. Have you considered a career in business? Some samurai adapted and became businessmen, officers, and officials. Others were furious and rose up in one last doomed rebellion, charging with swords and spirit against the new army's rifles and cannons. They lost. The age of the samurai was over forever. In just one generation, Japan transformed from a medieval, sword-carrying, isolated kingdom into a modern industrial nation with factories and warships. No country had ever modernized so fast. And now Japan wanted to prove itself on the world stage. It was about to do something that would leave the entire planet stunned. 1905 Japan shocks the world. By the early 1900s. The great European empires assumed that Asian nations were weak and easy to push around. Japan was about to shatter that assumption completely. First, Japan fought China in 1894 and won easily, seizing territory and announcing itself as the new power in Asia. But the real shock came a decade later. Japan went to war with Russia, one of the largest and most feared empires on Earth. Look at this map. See tiny Japan squaring off against the gigantic Russian Empire, a country many times its size? Everyone expected Japan to be crushed. Instead, Japan smashed the Russians on land in brutal battles, and then did something almost unbelievable at sea. The Russians sent their entire Baltic fleet halfway around the world, an 8-month voyage, to teach Japan a lesson. When that exhausted fleet finally arrived, the Japanese Navy was waiting and destroyed almost all of it in a single afternoon at the Battle of Tsushima. Admiral, the Russian fleet has finally arrived. They sailed 18,000 miles to get here. They must be exhausted. Completely, sir. Months at sea. Their ships are filthy and slow. And ours? Fresh, fast, and waiting right here in home waters. Then let's welcome them properly. By nightfall the Russian fleet was at the bottom of the sea. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had decisively defeated a major European power. The whole world took notice. Japan had arrived as a genuine great power, with an empire that now included Korea and parts of China. But this incredible success planted a dangerous seed. Japan's military grew more confident, more proud, and more convinced that conquest was the path to greatness. That confidence would soon curdle into something far darker, and lead Japan toward the greatest catastrophe in its entire history. 1940. When the empire overreaches through the 1930s, Japan's military took control of the government almost completely. Generals and admirals, not politicians, were steering the country, and they were hungry for more land and more resources. Japan invaded Manchuria, then plunged deep into China in a savage war. But all this conquest needed fuel, oil, and steel, and Japan had almost none of its own. It relied on imports, especially from the United States. So when America, Alarmed by Japan's brutal expansion, cut off its oil supply, Japan's leaders faced a choice. Back down, or gamble everything on a massive surprise attack to knock America out before it could fight back. They chose the gamble. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. "Admiral, if we attack America, we wake a sleeping giant. Their factories, their resources, they dwarf us. I know this better than anyone. I studied in America. I've seen their industry. Then why attack? Because our leaders have decided. I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, I have no confidence. And after that year? Let's not talk about after that year." At first, the gamble seemed to work brilliantly. Look at this map. See Japan explode outward across the Pacific, conquering an astonishing empire in a matter of months, sweeping through the Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, and countless islands. For a brief moment, Japan controlled a vast slice of the globe. But the Admiral's warning came true. America's factories roared to life, producing ships and planes faster than Japan could ever dream of. The tide turned at a naval battle called Midway, where Japan lost 4 of its best aircraft carriers in a single devastating day. From then on, America began grinding its way across the Pacific, island by bloody island, moving relentlessly closer to Japan itself. And as defeat loomed, Japan turned to a desperate, tragic weapon, and gave it that old familiar name from 700 years before. Kamikaze. Divine wind. But this time, it wasn't a storm. It was young pilots deliberately crashing their planes into enemy ships. The divine wind that had once saved Japan now meant its own children flying to certain death. 1945. 2 sons. By the summer of 1945, Japan was devastated. Its cities were being firebombed night after night. A single firebombing raid on Tokyo killed around 100,000 people in one night, more than almost any other air raid in history. Yet Japan's military leaders still refused to surrender, preparing every man, woman, and child to fight to the death on the home islands. The United States, wanting to end the war without a catastrophic invasion, had built a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. On August 6, 1945, a single American plane dropped a single bomb on the city of Hiroshima. In a flash brighter than the sun, most of the city simply ceased to exist. Around 70,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more would die from burns and radiation. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb fell on the city of Nagasaki. The destruction was beyond imagination. For the first time, the Emperor himself stepped in. "Your Majesty, the military insists we keep fighting. Every citizen a soldier. Bamboo spears if we must. And the new American weapons? 2 cities, Your Majesty. Gone. Each destroyed by a single bomb. A single bomb. A single bomb. Then the war is over. I will do what has never been done. I will speak to the people myself." On August 15, 1945, for the very first time in history, ordinary Japanese people heard the voice of their emperor on the radio, telling them the war was lost and they must, in his famous words, endure the unendurable. Japan surrendered. The empire was gone. Millions were dead. Its cities were ash. The country was occupied by a foreign army for the first time in its 2,000-year history. Japan had gambled everything and lost everything. It seemed impossible that this broken, defeated, starving nation could ever rise again. But Japan was about to pull off its second great reinvention, and stun the world one more time. 1964. The economic miracle. After the war, Japan lay in ruins, occupied by American forces led by General Douglas MacArthur. But instead of just punishing Japan, the Americans helped rebuild it, partly out of genuine reform and partly because they wanted a strong ally against communism in Asia. Japan got a new constitution, a real democracy, and a famous clause where it promised to never again wage war, keeping only a small self-defense force. Freed from spending money on a giant military, Japan poured all of its energy into one thing: building. And what it built next astonished the entire world. Japanese companies started making products that were cheap, then good, then the best in the world. Cars, cameras, televisions, radios. Names like Toyota, Sony, and Honda went from unknown to unstoppable. The same discipline and determination that had once built an empire was now aimed entirely at the economy. Sir, our little cars are selling everywhere. Even in America. The Americans are buying Japanese cars? By the millions. They're small, reliable, and cheap on fuel. 20 years ago we were at war with them. 20 years ago we made battleships. Now we make sedans. Business is better. And more televisions? We can barely build them fast enough. In 1964, Japan showed the world its transformation by hosting the Olympic Games in Tokyo, and unveiling the bullet train, the fastest train on Earth, a gleaming symbol of a nation reborn. Within a few decades of being firebombed and nuked into rubble, Japan became the second largest economy on the entire planet, behind only the United States. It was one of the greatest comebacks in human history. A nation that had been utterly destroyed rebuilt itself into a technological superpower in a single generation. Once again, Japan had reinvented itself completely. But no boom lasts forever. And Japan's incredible rise was about to hit an unexpected wall. Present the quiet giant by the late 1980s, Japan's economy was so hot that people genuinely believed it might overtake America and dominate the world. Property in Tokyo became so absurdly expensive that, on paper, the land under the Emperor's Palace was said to be worth more than the entire state of California. It was a bubble. And in the early 1990s, that bubble burst spectacularly. Stock prices and land prices collapsed. What followed is often called the lost decades, a long stretch of slow growth as Japan struggled to recover. On top of that, Japan faced a quieter, deeper challenge. Its people were living longer than almost anyone on Earth, but having fewer and fewer children. Look at Japan today, and you see a nation that is aging faster than almost any other, with more elderly people and fewer young workers every year. And yet, don't mistake any of this for decline into irrelevance. Japan remains one of the richest, safest, most advanced societies on the planet. Its trains still run to the second. Its cities are marvels of order and technology. And its culture conquered the world in a way its armies never could. Anime, manga, video games, sushi, karaoke. Japanese pop culture is loved by billions of people across every continent. The country that once locked itself away from the world is now one of the most beloved and visited places on it. Japan today is a quiet giant, powerful, peaceful, and still unmistakably itself. Outro, and that is 2,000 years of Japan. But here's the part most people miss. Everything that makes Japan so unique comes from that one incredible habit, its ability to completely reinvent itself, not once, but twice. It copied China and became something new. It locked itself away, then reopened and modernized faster than any nation ever had. It built an empire, lost everything, and rebuilt into an economic superpower from the ashes. No sword, no bomb, no army was ever Japan's real weapon. Its real weapon was reinvention. And if you want to see another empire that rose from absolutely nothing to conquer the largest land empire in all of history, the Mongols who once tried and failed to take Japan, click right here. That story gets insane. And I'll catch you next time.